No further ado, I would like to invite Brian Burns, a managing director at South of 2 Degrees, a former USA Congressional candidate to the United States. Brian, you don't have a presentation. You can.
No, you get to join me in this wonderful green void. So
yeah.
we'll cruise from there.
Yeah, but welcome, Brian. Welcome. Is an honor to have you, and the time is yours. You have 10 minutes to share your insights.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rui, and thank you to the OECD and the European Commission for supporting this panel on climate change, as it truly is the greatest threat the global community faces. And I will say, while the broader vision of GoveAfterShock is an amazing one, I would argue that this is the most important topic we can tackle, because as we move forward over the next several decades, nearly every policy you can imagine is going to be impacted by a warming planet. Now, as Rui mentioned, you may have picked up on the political nature of my background, but I want to be real clear. Anthropogenic climate change is not a political issue. It's a scientific fact, full stop. Now, as a policymaker, you have to manage a multitude of issues. And for me, this issue is so important that I left both a potential political career, as well as a successful business career, to put 100% of my time and effort behind this, or should I honestly say, when I'm not running a virtual elementary school, thanks to COVID and having my 3 children at home. So now I lead an organization, as Rui said, it's called South of 2 Degrees, that focuses on bringing scientific research to the forefront of the climate conversation. And we do that namely through a weekly podcast. Now, why through that medium? Well, science actually backs up doing it that way. A study published, I want to say in March of 2013, that was called Using the Theory of Planned Behavior to Investigate Determinants of Environmental Behavior Among Youth, which I know that sounds like definitely a title you're going to pick up at the local bookstore. But anyway, it was really interesting, because that study found that the highest social pressure that influenced environmental action was family and friends. Family, 53.8%, friends, 41.4%. And that means if you take the information that you learn here today from my wonderful fellow panelists, that I have the honor of sharing the virtual stage with, if you will, today, and go out and talk about what you've learned, or better yet, lead by example and do something about it, you can influence nearly half of the behavior of your social circle, which is a pretty powerful ability. So I encourage you to do so. Now, speaking of leading by example, I think that's as good a segue as any, albeit slightly ironic, into talking about the United States today. Now, since I have the benefit of having another American on the panel, and Amanda's incredible, you're going to hear from her right after the break. The two of us are going to break up US policy into 2 parts. I'll cover very briefly what federal policies of the past have been effective, and she'll look at how we're getting around some of the roadblocks and, frankly, a lack of leadership at the federal level by acting on a state and city level. So for the US, for the most part, we face a framing problem when it comes to anthropogenic climate change. And the question is, how do we tackle something so incredibly big when we have a far from insignificant part of the population that has an aversion to or is skeptical of change? Unfortunately, the United States, and by proxy, the rest of the world, for us, science has become politicized. And again, I do, in fact, and as I move through the policy today, no, I'm not trying to be political, only factual. And if it seems politically biased, that's simply because one group has decided to focus on fighting anthropogenic climate change more than the other. And that's just how the United States has addressed the issue as a society. So when you look at our actions, you can understand why it's difficult to lead by example, which we desperately need to do as the world's second largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So let me highlight an example of why we have a difficult time leading, despite it being so important. In 1997, then President Bill Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol along with more than 150 other countries. Now in 2001, then President George W. Bush pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol. Now we moved to COP21 in Paris in 2015. Then President Barack Obama signed the Paris Accord, something I might add all 196 members of the UNFCCC have now done. Yet in 2019, Trump invoked Article 28 of the Paris Accord to withdraw from it, which came to pass just a few days ago on November 4th of this year, which gives the United States the singular distinction of being the only country in the world to do so. Now, that said, President-elect Joe Biden has announced that he will, on day one of his presidency, rejoin. So I get it when you look around the world and question if the United States is truly going to lead or not. But with that, let's look at the policy that's been effective in the United States over the past 4 years and where we stand. So to start off, the United States commitment under the Paris Accord was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below our 2005 levels by 2025. And 2005 was our peak levels as a country. Now, the goal was to be 17% below 2005 levels by this year. And further, to hit the 2025 target, the US would require about an annual rate of 2.3 to 2.8% before we'd have to make deeper cuts from 2025 in an attempt, like Germany, to be carbon neutral by 2050. Now, the capstone climate legislation, in the United States to get us there was President Obama's Clean Power Plan. And the Clean Power Plan was actually proposed in the US in 2014, unveiled by President Obama in 2015, which made it one of the first sweeping pieces of legislation to address climate change of any of the major developed nations at the time. However, the Clean Power Plan shared some similarities with some of the aspects of the Paris Accord that have made it widely adopted, and that is to allow each party, in this case, each one of our states, to make the decision on how to best achieve their part in hitting our national target. So in other words, the federal government set the targets and the individual states set the tactics, which affords them the flexibility and local control. And it also minimizes the optics of an overarching authority dictating terms. Now, the states were afforded the use of three major building blocks to get there. And those were, one, increasing the generation efficiency of existing fossil fuel plants, two, substituting lower carbon dioxide emitting natural gas generation for coal-powered generation, and three, substituting generation from a new zero carbon dioxide emitting renewable source for fossil fuel power generation. So this policy was estimated to reduce CO2 emissions from the power generation sector by about 32% by 2030. And further, while we often think about climate legislation in terms of the climate, which makes sense, there's also some positive externalities that come along with the reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And the Clean Power Plan was estimated to prevent 90,000 childhood asthma attacks, 3,600 premature deaths. And while I won't run through the list or bore you with the list of everything, by 2030, the cumulative public health benefit was actually estimated at about 54 billion US dollars. And further, wind power was estimated to rise close to 300% above 2008 levels, and solar nearly 2,000%. Now, as great as that sounds, it ran into a problem that most of you are well aware of that derailed it, and that was a switch in administrations. Under President Trump, in his changes within the EPA, the Clean Power Plan was repealed. His administration rolled back a lot of the prior policies from the previous administration, and if not replaced with more aggressive action by now President-elect Joe Biden, a whopping 1.8 gigatons, or approximately 1/3 of all 2019 emissions, is going to be our increase by the time we hit 2035. And while COVID isn't a policy per se, so technically, I guess, outside the bounds of our conversation today, I'll say that the impact of it has almost put the US back on track to meet our Paris Accord commitments. However, a lot of this is going to depend on how we choose to recover, both economically and socially. And right now, that's a little unsure, a little shaky here in the US. So look, at the end of the day, while it takes making hard choices and doing hard work, no country can stand alone here. And, you know, climate change has no borders. And what makes a global climate agreement work, or any agreement actually, is trust. And I get that because of our back and forth nature, it might be hard for the world to trust us.